Very excited to have Nima Kulkarni here with us today. Nima Kulkarni is an immigration attorney and the executive director of the New Americans Initiative, which serves to educate and assist Kentucky's immigration population. She also serves as the representative for District 40 in the Kentucky House of Representatives. We're just really lucky to have her in Kentucky. She has a rare combination of depth of policy understanding and community engagement that we get to have in Kentucky. And so we're just so grateful for your leadership. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, perfect. I am going to share my screen and go fairly quickly. I think I'd like to reserve some time if possible for questions, so maybe 10-15 minutes at the end, and let me know as well, kind of how short on time we are,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So let me. Okay. Can folks see?
Yep, that's good.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh,
Thanks.
perfect. Okay. So again, thank you for inviting me. As Eric mentioned, I am a state rep, immigration attorney, and most recently executive director of New Americans Initiative. Just very briefly, the whole purpose and mission of New Americans Initiative is to mobilize and engage our foreign-born communities, our immigrant and refugee communities, in terms of civic engagement and organizing and just being more involved in our representative democracy. The shorter term, since this administration took office last January, the most urgent need that we have found in our communities has been just understanding what is going on with our immigration laws, our policies, what is going on with immigration enforcement. What can we do? What are our rights and obligations under the law, under the Constitution, and how do we sort of navigate this ever shifting landscape as we move forward? So this is a version of a kind of know your rights presentation and policy update that we've been providing to different organizations, nonprofits, schools, churches, businesses. And so I'll go fairly quickly through them and may skip over a few slides, but Eric, do let me know when we're at about 10 minutes out, if you don't mind. So again, this is the primary question that we've gotten from organizations is how do we keep our community safe? How do we keep our congregants safe, neighbors, students, et cetera? And so that is how we've sort of shaped the agenda and the points that we're going to cover in this presentation. So we're going to talk about some relevant law, some policy updates, a little bit about United States Code Section 1324, and then what can you do? What can individuals do? What can organizations do? If ICE shows up at their door, we'll talk a little bit about state and local laws, and then probably skip through some of the immigrant and refugee contributions that have been made in Kentucky. Even though I think we all kind of understand the economic argument about making sure we keep our small business owners, our physicians, and our professionals here, as in addition to our students, and making sure that we don't jeopardize any of that, because they do like to move to Kentucky. It's safer, it's quieter, it's a better quality of life for a lot of folks that are moving to the United States. So I always start by saying the constitutional rights protect all of us, regardless of immigration status. That is not always how it's portrayed. But again, the U.S. Constitution does guarantee certain rights under the law, regardless of where you were born. A quick disclaimer, nothing in this presentation is legal advice. It does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. And a lot of these materials and sources and references have been compiled with information from ACLU, the National Immigration Law Center, and the Immigrant Legal Resource Centers, which are all fantastic places that you can go and find reports and analysis and updates about what is going on specifically with our immigration laws and policies. So, very generally speaking, how do we best protect our immigrant and refugee families? There's several things that each of us can do, regardless of our position or our organization's position. And really, basically, you can provide information and resources to these communities, connect them with groups like New Americans Initiative or with other organizations that are serving immigrants and refugees, whether it's Louisville, Lexington, or out in the state. those that can provide information and resources. So depending on what people need and what they are being what they're facing. So it's a lot different for somebody who is afraid of actually actively being detained. So the proactive steps that they might want to take if they are removable right now in Kentucky is to do things like preparedness plans and places like La Casita, DCBS, our cabinet for Family and Health Services, and different organizations are able to help provide those, which are essentially plans of action and compilations of information like immigration files that can be given to an attorney, given to a trusted adult who can then take care of the children that are left behind or an aging parent that might have been taken care of. How do you make sure that those family members are taken care of if somebody does not come home from work, for instance, or come home from the grocery store, which is happening. This administration has shifted away their tactics, shifted their tactics from sort of large scale mass raids that we saw early on, especially most recently in Minnesota, to smaller, quieter, sort of more targeted pickups from our local jails. So you're not necessarily going to hear about this unless you know the people, you know the community, or they themselves are connected with individuals who might be able to help them with things like preparedness plans, connecting them to legal resources or attorneys, connecting them to people who might be able to take care of the rent or provide food or provide transportation for family members. Very briefly, there are US born children that have not acquired their passport. Um, and that is something that we are advising folks to do just so they have that documentation proving to an immigration official, an immigration enforcement agent, that this child is a U.S. citizen and is not deportable from this country, even though their parents might currently be in detention. And any of us can provide a safe space in counseling. One of the biggest issues right now is trust between, sort of targeted immigrant and refugee communities and the larger community, for them knowing who they can trust outside their communities to go with questions, to go to with requests for help on certain things that they might need. And so just being a person that is trusted by a family or by an individual where they know they can ask you these questions without fear of being turned over to ICE, without fear of being exploited or exposed in any kind of way is critical in this time. And that's something that we can each do individually in our daily lives through even just acts of kindness. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to know everything, but it is good to know who you can connect these individuals and families to for their next steps. Very briefly, I sort of compiled these day one. This is day one executive orders on immigration. And I just want to note, and I want folks to note that the titles on these executive orders, for instance, protecting the American people against invasion, protecting the meaning and value of citizenship, protecting our country from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats. A lot of it has been framed as immigrants and immigration being a threat to our country, a security threat, public safety threat to our communities, regardless of their status, whether they came in as refugees or asylum seekers, whether they are here as professionals, whether they came in on a parole under the Biden administration and have been here for several years for humanitarian reasons and have built businesses and raised families in that time. Doesn't matter. The entire framing of it has been about a threat to the United States and immigrants specifically as threats to our safety and national security. Some of them, by the way, have been blocked. Some of them have been partially blocked. Several of them are in effect. There's a multitude of lawsuits that we won't have time to get into right now. A lot of federal judges issuing injunctions, being overturned or upheld by courts of appeal around the country, and probably the most impactful ones will make their way to the Supreme Court for final adjudication. That includes this executive order 14160, which is that birthright citizenship one. The Supreme Court is set to hear that on its merits this term. A quick graphic. A lot of folks don't realize this, but Department of Homeland Security is made up of three agencies. It was created under the Patriot Act. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has only really existed since then, since 2003. Customs and Border Protection is the other immigration enforcement agency that is part of Department of Homeland Security. And this map shows the inherent jurisdiction that Customs and Border Protection has within 100 miles of the border of the United States. People don't realize often that almost 2 out of 3 individuals in America live within this 100-mile border zone. That's the entirety of Maine. It's the entirety of Florida, Minnesota. It is important to understand that they have that jurisdiction to essentially take someone and remove them from the United States. They have the authority to stop people at checkpoints. They have the authority to do reasonable searches, and they don't have the capacity to detain you for an extended period of time. But we have been hearing, of course, reports of that, and unless you have access to counsel, it's difficult to argue in that moment why you should be allowed to move further into the United States. Um, New executive orders, one of them, again, there have been several. There's been over 100, probably over 200. One of them expanded what's called expedited removal. Expedited removal means that anybody that's not able to show, that's able to document that they've been in the United States lawfully for 2 years or more, they're subject to something called expedited removal. So Customs and Border Protection has that inherent authority to remove somebody without having to go through an immigration judge or any kind of due process or process that's administrative or judicial. So they can just remove you if you're within that 100-mile border, but expanding it, what this executive order did was make that applicable nationwide. And so, again, if a person cannot in the moment show an immigration enforcement officer or agent that they have been allowed to be in the United States lawfully for 2 years or more, will be subject to expedited removal, which means they can be immediately detained either in a local jail or taken to a federal detention facility. Primarily, they are in Texas and Louisiana, and then just removed to a country. And I'll get to that in a minute. So people now, what we are advising individuals and families to do is to carry documentation. I will say that green cards are expensive. They're expensive to replace, and it takes a long time to do so. I was naturalized when I was 14. I do not carry around my naturalization certificate. I have been carrying around my passport, however, and a lot of individuals have, just to prove in the moment that you are a U.S. citizen. But a lot of people don't want to carry around those original documents, especially children. You cannot trust that a child is going to be able to keep that important document safe. So we've been advising folks to get certified copies of those documents. Again, showing 2 years of residence, showing lawful presence, showing what their status is in the United States. Quick note, if somebody is there who is seeking asylum, who maybe has a pending asylum case, they need to be able to say, they need to know that they're allowed to say to the officer that they're afraid to return to their home country because of persecution or fear of persecution, and they need to voice that and make it clear to the officer in that moment. So one of the things that expansion of expedited removal has also impacted is this idea of third country removal. This is not a new concept. It is a concept that has expanded aggressively on an unprecedented level under this particular administration. It was sort of revived under the previous Trump administration. It was, restricted under the Biden administration, but it is now something that is being aggressively pursued with a lot of different countries so that people who can't return, right, to their home countries because of persecution or fear of persecution are now looking to be removed by our government to third countries that they have no connection with. They don't speak the language. They don't have any community or family in those countries. There are a lot of countries where they might have come from as refugees. For instance, we have an agreement with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which the last couple of years, that's been the primary source of resettled refugees in the United States and in Kentucky as well. So we are saying that we could potentially take somebody who is a refugee from that country, who has lived potentially in for decades, for 2 decades sometimes, in a refugee camp in a third country, finally be resettled to the United States, only to be removed back to that country that they had to flee those many years ago. It is a very convoluted and very dangerous practice. And it's something that we are expanding. So we started with sort of Central America, we've moved into South America, we've moved into Africa, and we are continuing to, I say we, our federal government is continuing to explore these contracts with these countries. And of course, these are countries that we're paying. So they have a financial incentive to say, sure, we'll take these people. We don't know what they do with those people. We don't know where they're kept. We don't know what conditions they're kept in. We have essentially washed our hands of them once they have been deported um, to that third country. So, you might have heard about the Alien Enemies Act. This is a very old, obscure act that is usually reserved for wartime, and a court did ultimately rule that this administration could not invoke it. But they did, and removed about 200 migrants who are not from El Salvador to El Salvador to be held in one of the most notorious prisons in the world without any kind of due process. So the Supreme Court ordered the administration to return one of those individuals because of a very high profile court case. But we did have a federal judge block this practice this February of 2026. Almost immediately, a court of appeals lifted that block. So third country deportations are continuing while this particular case moves through the legal process. Very briefly, I'll touch on something called the No Sensitive Locations Memo. This is an internal memo from USCIS that was issued effective 2011. And it basically said that we should not do immigration enforcement operations in sensitive locations like hospitals or schools or churches. This was another day one action by this administration that just basically rescinded that policy, again, that had been in place since 2011. So ICE, Customs and Border Protection, any of the other federal agents that have been sort of deployed for immigration enforcement, even if that's not their primary mission, can take enforcement actions in any of these locations. Almost immediately, there was a court challenge primarily by a group of Quakers and Baptists and Sikhs. And so they do have an injunction for the rescission of that no sensitive locations memo, or sorry, of the sensitive locations memo. But that only applies to about 1,400 of their specific locations, places of worship, around, I think it's across about 36 states. And so that means that ICE, Customs and Border Protection, law enforcement cannot go into any of these spaces without a judicial warrant. So judicial warrants are, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the types of warrants that do allow law enforcement, that do allow the entry and search and seizure within a home or a workplace that is not a public place. So a quick set of facts, data update on ICE enforcement. In January, we had over 70,000 people detained by ICE nationally, January of 2026. That is a record high in that agency's 23-year history, and it's an 84% increase since just last year. And those are people that nationwide have been detained by ICE. According to Kentucky Policy, which is another fantastic resource for information and analysis and data, about 1,300 individuals had been detained in Kentucky, and they are being kept in our local jails. That is increasingly the practice of this administration, is to take people, keep them in local jails. ICE picks them up, takes them to a federal detention facility. Increasingly, Kentucky is becoming kind of a holding place for people who are being taken from other states. So they're being taken in other states, they're being taken to Kentucky, local jails in and around different cities throughout Kentucky. So it's not even sort of concentrated in one area. And then they're being picked up by ICE and taken either to a Louisiana or Texas facility. In 2025, the daily average of folks in ICE custody in Kentucky specifically was 120, and right now it's over 1,000. And fewer, again, this is something I know folks have read about in the news, because the contention that we're, sort of only going after the worst of the worst, we're going after violent criminals, we're going after human traffickers, we're going after drug smugglers, was almost immediately found to be false. And this administration has been going after everybody, regardless of their criminal history, if they have one. And so that has been borne out by the data, where fewer than 10% of those who are in detention were charged with violent crimes. 75% of that number is actually increased, have no record beyond traffic or immigration violations. Traffic stops, by the way, are the most common pipeline for people to be picked up. There was an individual picked up, for instance, in Casey County because of a license plate that was not illuminated enough. So there wasn't even any speeding. There was no car wreck. There was no other violation, reckless driving, broken taillight. It was a license plate not being bright enough. Was kept in jail, in that local jail, for a week and a half before an attorney was able to file a habeas petition, kept in that jail with no charge. So the liability to our local jails and our local counties and cities is something that needs to be taken into accord, because also these local jails are being paid to hold these individuals. So there is funding now behind a policy that the administration tried last time, but there's no funding attached last time. Now there is. So things like overtime can be paid, things like hiring more individuals for immigration enforcement is happening. Um, since last August, Louisville specifically changed their ICE detainer policy. So there is a policy that was demanded to be implemented by then Attorney General Pam Bondi. And it basically said that you need to hold individuals who are in your jails for 48 hours after they would normally be released without any charges, or anything like that. When that sort of letter went out, Louisville was the only city in the country to sort of immediately comply. And we have continued that policy. Other jurisdictions sued and said, you can't, for instance, hold our federal funding. You can't freeze that. And courts have upheld their challenges. But Louisville did not challenge, and Louisville continues to be the only place that immediately sort of did that from day one. That is something that I think is important to note, because, again, this is a very common pipeline for ICE to come pick up individuals and put them into federal detention. We know that ICE is seeking and has obtained additional office space in Louisville to expand administrative operations, including more attorneys and including sort of ways to process the individuals that they are picking up. And they're looking also at warehouse space around Kentucky to expand detention capacity within Kentucky itself. And so what we have seen is a shift from these sort of mass raids nationwide. There haven't been mass raids in Kentucky, but there are increased targeted enforcement and local jail pickups as that is happening nationwide as well. A quick note about 287G agreements. Essentially, this is the federal enforcement, the federal program that allows state and local law enforcement officers to collaborate or coordinate with federal government agencies to enforce federal immigration laws. There have been multiple challenges because of the different models, but there have been different challenges to each of them, especially in places like Arizona, where things like that task force or hybrid model were found unconstitutional. Kentucky tried to file a similar piece of legislation in 2020. None of those moved forward in terms of mandating that statewide. There was legislation introduced this term as well. I would say 4 to 6 pieces of legislation to see how we could mandate cooperation from local law enforcement to collaborate in that task force model, which is the most resource intensive model. And it's the one that you see law enforcement actually going and assisting in immigration apprehension raids or in targeted apprehensions as well. As of last January, when this administration took office, there were 0 287G agreements in Kentucky, and that number had been dwindling nationwide because there were so many lawsuits, there were so many civil rights violations, there was so much racial profiling. And so there were very few 287G agreements around the country and none in Kentucky. As of yesterday, there's 36, and you can find out in real time who has entered into a 287G agreement with ICE and what type of model they have. So we have, for instance, sheriff's departments, we have detention centers, we have police departments, and that includes the Heritage Creek Police Department, which is within Jefferson County. So LMPD is not on that list, ICE list of 287G agreements, but within Jefferson County, you have a smaller city that has a police force that has. So there's a lot of confusion that opens up, because who is funding what becomes a question. Whose resources are being used to do this, and what exactly are they doing? But you have all of these offices that have entered into 287G agreements as of yesterday. A quick note about flock cameras. This has been in the news as well, increasingly around the country. There have been several states that have moved to regulate their use and the sharing of data. So Flock is a private company and have maintained that we have no control. If a government agency wants this information, we will give it to them unless we have some proactive laws in that city or county or state that tell us we cannot do it. Kentucky did pass a bill this session that did restrict how much information is shared, because it's a lot of data that gets picked up by these automatic license plate readers. So you have license plate, they can look at who's driving, they can look at locations, they can look at patterns of movement, dates, times, images of the vehicle, and it's a huge database with a lot of data points that can be used to link a person to a place, link relatives to a person, link workplaces, religious sites, if they go to try to get medical care. All of those movements can be identified, and the patterns and routines can be identified based on what information is captured through these flock cameras. So it's really important that we make sure that information is only shared for legitimate law enforcement purposes and not for immigration enforcement. That became an issue in Louisville because there was an LMPD officer that was searching specifically for immigration enforcement purposes and sharing that information with ICE, which is in violation. We don't know, it's unclear, could be in violation of that ordinance that Louisville has about collaboration for immigration enforcement by LMPD. I think an investigation was done, but nothing really came of it. So very quickly, Section 1324 of the United States Code is a federal law that criminalizes several actions that someone might take to try and help a person either come to the United States or stay in the United States without authorization. And so the penalties can include fines, imprisonment, or both. It is a criminal statute. And this is something that was expanded under the previous Trump administration. And the Department of Justice has been tasked with increasing prosecutions under this specific section of the code. So some of the actions that are criminalized under that statute are things like smuggling, transporting, which are pretty straightforward to understand. But then you have things like harboring, shielding, or concealing, and then things like encouraging or inducing someone to stay or come to this country without authorization. And those can be interpreted very broadly. So if you run a food pantry, are you encouraging that family or that individual to stay in the United States because you're providing them with food or shelter, or encouraging them to go to school or start a life? It is very broad. The good part, or the kind of silver lining, is that statute also requires that the government, the prosecution, has to prove intent. So you have to intend to violate this statute, and that's a much, much higher burden. So we haven't seen the numbers of prosecutions that this administration would like to see under this particular statute, but it is used as a tool for intimidation for a lot of like nonprofits or faith-based organizations or community groups that are trying to help individuals by providing services or programs. Quick note about warrants generally. So there's two types that are applicable in this situation. There's judicial warrants and there's administrative warrants. Judicial warrants are signed by a judge and will say things like U.S. District Court or Commonwealth of Kentucky across the top. Police are allowed to enter the home or the workplace or a school where a person is inside that they are trying to apprehend. So they are allowed to search that premises. They are allowed to apprehend individuals because those individuals and the reason the probable cause for that action will have been listed and proven to a judge. So judicial warrants pass constitutional muster, administrative warrants do not. And those are the warrants that most often ICE, Customs and Border Protection, other federal agencies would use. They do not allow for entry without consent into a private home, workplace, or a school. Consent has become a very important concept to be aware of, because there have been instances of ICE entering someone's home because a small child opened the door, and cannot possibly be expected to question an officer whether or not they have a warrant to enter. But that was taken as implied consent, and entry was made and people apprehended. So it's something to be mindful of, the difference and the importance of making sure that you have your information, this information provided to family members, that children aren't opening doors, that everybody's mindful of just the potential escalation of that situation. This is an image, and it's a very kind of basic image, but it can show you pretty clearly how much information is needed. On the left is a judicial warrant, and on the right is an administrative warrant. You can see that it needs to have a judicial warrant needs to have the right address. It needs to have a time and a date, a purpose, a specific location. It is signed by a judge, and it has to be current. Administrative warrants are more you're filling out blanks or ticking check boxes, and could be or may not be signed by an immigration officer, who we don't know who they are, their position, where they are, or what the purpose of this warrant is. So one of them, the judicial warrant, does allow entry into these private spaces. Administrative warrants do not. This is more along the lines of what do you do if ICE shows up at your workplace or in your facility or your organization. The first thing to do is have a communication plan that is set up either in your workplace or your organization during services if it's a church. You want to stay calm and you want to have point people. So you want to have a plan of communication where the person who is going to be sort of at the intake point is able to either ask specific questions or call the next person, the director or supervisor or somebody who has been designated as a point person, to then say, do you have a warrant? Why are you here? Be able to say they don't have consent into private spaces, which is the next thing that should be done. So there needs to be sort of a step-by-step plan, I would say, that organizations and facilities need to have. You want to be able to clearly distinguish public areas from private areas. That becomes a little problematic for especially churches and temples where they may have their doors open to people 24 hours a day. And so they can always put up signs saying this is a private area. And as long as it's clear and distinguishable by an officer or a reasonable person, then they would need a warrant to enter into those private areas. If they don't, you don't have to consent into entry. You want to make sure, again, this is whoever the point people are in that organization or facility. You want to make sure they know all the entrances and exits, and that they know that to ask the officers to identify themselves. We had an anti-masking ordinance that was voted down last December in Metro Council, which would basically extend the same requirement that LMPD has, where they have to identify themselves, they have to identify their purpose, and that would just extend to federal officers as well. It was voted down for fear of sort of poking the bear of this administration, which I think we all can say that ship has sailed. But the issue there is that if you aren't able to get the officer to identify themselves, you want to be able to write down everything that you can remember for later, because a lot of these have been used in court cases after the fact successfully by attorneys. So you want to write down names or badge information if that's available. If not, you want to write down there were 5 people, this is what they were dressed like, this is what they wanted, this is what they were asking for, just anything, any details that would need to be recalled later about that interaction. If they do provide documents, you want to make a copy of everything, take a picture, make sure you have, again, in that organization communication plan, if there's an attorney on call or you've been connected with an attorney, to see is this a judicial warrant? Is it legitimate? And do I need to allow them to enter the premises? Again, administrative immigration warrants do not without consent. Make the copies, send them to an attorney. Always listen to your attorney. Don't sign anything. But especially in places where there are clients or there's individuals being served, you want to try to prevent direct confrontation with agents and clients. Assign somebody who's able to sort of take them aside and support them, just to keep the entire situation calm. These are very stressful, very chaotic situations. So the main thing is to try and diffuse as much as possible. Obviously, nobody's releasing statements or client information without approval. That is critical. And it might be obvious, but it has been done. And so we just want to make sure that that is part of that plan. If rumors are spreading, we early on, especially last year, had a lot of rumors. There's ICE at this school. There's ICE at GE. And a lot of times they're not verified. And sometimes they get in the way of legitimate, enforcement, not even immigration enforcement, but just investigations that are taking place. And that did happen in Lexington. So if rumors are spreading, ICE is at your facility or your workplace or your organization, you want to be able to issue a statement of fact, and make sure that people know that their rights and their privacy are always being protected. This is more for individuals who may be stopped or detained by immigration officials or law enforcement, depending on the circumstances. Again, you want to make sure that they know that they don't have to sign anything. They have the right to remain silent. One important point is that last bullet. Remember your A number. The A number is the alien registration number, and it's a number that's assigned to every immigrant. And that's the way they're identified. They're identified by that A number in terms of benefits applications with USCIS. So if you're applying for a work permit, you're applying for a green card or citizenship, that's going to be your A number. It's also the way you are going to be identified and located in detention. So there is a detention sort of website you can go to try to find somebody. And one of the ways that you can search, or an attorney can search for that individual to find out where they are or where they've been taken, is through that A number. So you want to make sure individuals have their file, any communication, any applications with the government, and the sort of A number prominently available. So that, again, if you need to go to an attorney, they will have all that information. One of the things about don't sign anything unless it's been reviewed by a lawyer is individuals have signed things like waiver of their right to a hearing before an immigration judge. They have signed something called a stipulated removal order, which is basically you saying, I am removable and I should be removed from this country, or taking voluntary departure. They may not understand what they're signing. They don't speak the language. They may be told it's something else, and that they'll be released if they sign, but that is not the case. And that will be used later on to make them removable or physically remove them from the country. So it's important to not ever sign anything unless it's been reviewed by an attorney, whether you're an organization or an individual. Very quickly, I want to direct your attention to this website. It's wehaverights.us, and they have these it's a sort of collaboration with ACLU and different projects around, like rights projects, civil rights, human rights groups. The Brooklyn Defender's Office is part of this as well. So basically little videos about what to do. So how are you as an individual? What are your rights? How do you safely document an interaction? What do you do if ICE is at your home? What is the sort of preparedness plan that you need to make for your family? So it's a good resource. It's a good sort of way to get snippets of information, a lot of information in a very digestible format. Some of the resources that we use, again, we have rights.us, National Immigration Law Center, Immigration Legal Resource Center, Familias Unidas. We use that as a sort of template for the preparedness checklist that we use in some of our workshops. And then, of course, our website is NAIKY, that's New Americans Initiative. .org. I'm going to skip over some of this. This is a presentation, part of a presentation I made to the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity, to explain why it's important for people to take that next step, right? If you're eligible for a green card, you're eligible for citizenship, because you're able to get things like in-state, or you were able to get things like in-state tuition, different types of scholarships, access to funding for a small business, and of course, the right to vote. This is something I always try to make people understand, is the economic impact and the economic contributions of immigrants and refugees in Kentucky. They're about 4.5% of our total population, but they are 5% of our workforce. They're 7% of all business owners. They're 13% of our Main Street small business owners. 16% of our physicians in Kentucky are foreign born, and then they represent 24% of our information technology, like software developers. So the economic impact of this, beyond even things like agriculture or tourism or hospitality, is large. It's significant, and we need to remember that when we think about, especially in Kentucky, how are we addressing the shifts in federal immigration policy, and how are we navigating that to best protect our people. A quick
We're
note about New
just,
Americans Initiative. Oh,
you asked me to give you like a 10-minute warning, and we're about there, so just wanted to let you
okay.
know.
All right. I'm almost done. So I can just end the slideshow. Let me see. This is how we get there. This is how we kind of get to that civic engagement, and that is focusing on pathways to citizenship. So we do green card, legal representation, and we do citizenship. The limited representation, meaning we have workshops that we provide for free. So we help with these applications, send them out. We're the only organization currently in Kentucky able to do that for free. Part of that is also education and outreach on why it's important to become a citizen, voter registration, civic engagement, and sort of building coalitions and partnerships with other nonprofits and immigrant serving organizations around Kentucky. Some sources, that's for a lot of the economic statistics that I had provided, but Migration Policy Institute and American Immigration Council are also fantastic resources for a wealth of knowledge over decades about shifts in our immigration policy. All right, and I will pause there and see if there are any questions.